What would you do if your child's bike in the driveway cost you a fine? For one dad, that single ticket didn't just spark frustration. It started a war with his HOA. What began as a simple rule violation exploded into a neighborhood divided, a battle of paper and a playground that changed everything. Stay tuned, because this isn't just a story about swings and slides. It's about defiance, revenge, and the fight for family life in the face of HOA control. Just when he thought the playground battle was over, the HOA struck back harder. Letters turned into threats, neighbors began to pick sides, and the board called an emergency hearing at the clubhouse. Would the dad's binder of evidence be enough to save the playground? Or was the HOA ready to shut it all down for good? What happened next left the entire neighborhood in shock. The morning the orange envelope arrived, the neighborhood still looked like a postcard. Trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes, driveways that gleamed a little too clean for a weekday. I had never thought much about how perfect everything looked until the paper inside that envelope told me our family was the problem. It listed a violation number at the top and then a line item that felt like a personal accusation. One bicycle, left visible in the driveway overnight. $25 due within 10 days. Language about community standards followed in careful paragraphs that sounded polite and cold at the same time. I stood there and thought about bike chains clicking over our driveway like the sound a kid makes when he finally learns balance. I thought about skinned knees and a little bell that never rang quietly. All of it reduced to a nuisance on formatted letterhead. That single sheet changed the way I noticed my own block. The next time I pushed the stroller to the corner, I saw the signs I had ignored. No outdoor equipment unless stored out of sight. No toys visible from the street. No chalk art on sidewalks. It became a scavenger hunt for rules. Our cul-de-sac was full of young families, yet there was nothing in sight to suggest that children actually lived here. No basketball hoops. No scooters tipped against steps. No bubble wands forgotten on porches. You could hear laughter in the evenings, but you could not see its trail. It started to feel like the neighborhood wanted the sound of kids without the evidence that kids make things a little messy. I paid the fine that week and tucked the receipt into a folder. The act felt small and sour. It was not the money. It was the message. I cleaned our garage top to bottom like the letter had reached out and tugged my shoulders forward. Bikes hung on hooks, balls nested in bins. Helmets sat like polished fruit on a shelf. The driveway looked bare, and the house looked like it was holding its breath. In that quiet, I kept replaying the afternoon before the fine. My son had rolled to a stop in the driveway, tired and proud, and left his bike near the hedge. He had gone inside with a grin and grass stains on both knees. We had made hot chocolate despite the heat because he called it a victory drink. I had rinsed the mug later and seen the bike from the kitchen window. I had decided to leave it. Childhood has a rhythm. You do not always put away the best parts of a day as if they were tools. Most conflicts start small and then grow into something else. Mine grew the first Saturday after the fine, the cul-de-sac filled with quiet. Lawns hummed with mowers. Leaf blowers traced steady lines along curbs. There was space everywhere for play, but there was nowhere to play. I watched my son circle the dining table with his helmet on because he wanted to ride somewhere. I watched my daughter stack plastic cups in the entryway because the sidewalk chalk stayed in a bin. I felt the oddness of a neighborhood designed to look like a place for families while it sanded off anything that made family life visible. The problem was not the fine. The problem was the way rules shaped what children could be in public. Small, silent, tidied away. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of our yard and tried to picture something different. The space behind our house was a rectangle of lawn with nothing to do but mow. It caught the sun most of the day and sat at an angle that hid it from street view. I measured with long strides because I could not find the tape measure, and I tried to imagine where shadows fell at 4 in the afternoon. I pictured a swing that creaked and drew kids like a bell draws a congregation. I pictured a little climbing wall that turned fear into skill. I pictured a ground cover that could take a fall without turning elbows into gravel. I let myself think bigger and then I reined myself in. I did not want a structure to taunt the HOA. I wanted a space for children that lasted longer than an angry impulse. The more I thought, the simpler the plan became. Start with a play set that met every safety standard I could find. Keep colors calm so the view looked like a backyard, not a carnival. Add a sandbox with a sturdy lid. Install a rubber mulch border to keep everything contained and clean. Set a small sign at the side gate that said neighbors were welcome during daylight hours. Let the quality speak for itself. The yard would not be a park. It would be a backyard designed for what the neighborhood claimed to care about, but kept pushing inside. Family life, laughter, a little bit of honest mess that could be swept at the end of the day. I read guidelines late at night with a pen in hand. The HOA covenants lived online in tidy PDFs with sections on outbuildings and structures. A swing set qualified as temporary equipment if it was not anchored in concrete and did not exceed a certain height. Fences had height limits. Landscaping had to look intentional. Noise restrictions started at a specific hour. The document focused on sight lines, setbacks, and uniformity. It did not ban joy by name. It could not. I highlighted lines, checked measurements, and mapped the play set against the rules until I could see the project in my sleep. The plan that formed was not a stunt. It was compliance with purpose. Purchasing the materials felt like choosing a direction for our family. I compared sets that were flimsy with sets built from thick cedar. I checked third-party safety certifications. I looked for designs that could hold more than a couple of kids to avoid arguments in a small space. When the boxes arrived in a stack taller than my car, our driveway became a staging area for a weekend. This time, every piece was moved quickly to the back. There would be no orange envelope about packages left in public view. The sun hit the boxes and warmed the smell of wood until our yard felt like a lumber yard on the first day of spring. Assembly took time, sweat, and more patience than I thought I had. The instructions were clear but long. The pieces were heavy. The ground needed leveling. I learned the rhythm of pre-drilled holes and lag bolts. I learned how to set posts into tamped gravel so they held firm without permanent anchors. I learned that building something for children demands that adults be careful in a way that builds trust. My son handed me screws like a surgeon's assistant and told me without words that this was the best project he had ever seen. My daughter drew future games in the dust with the tip of a stick. The day stretched, then narrowed, then stretched again. By evening, the frame stood upright and it did not sway. The first test was not a child. It was me. I stepped onto the platform and bounced once. Nothing moved. The structure settled with a gentle sound like a tree accepting a swing rope. I climbed down and felt the ache in my hands and the heat on my neck. I ran my palms along every edge to catch a splinter while my mind worked through the safety checklist. Spacing between rails. Distance from the fence. Fall zones cleared of stones. The gate latched with a clear click. The mulch felt springy underfoot and quieted the sound of each step like a promise. On Sunday, I finished the sandbox. The lid was heavier than it looked and swung open on weatherproof hinges. I poured in the sand, raked the surface flat, and pressed my palm into it as if it were a cornerstone. When the wind shifted, the smell of cedar mixed with the clean dust of new sand. It felt like a new room had opened in our home, one that just happened to live under the sky. I cleaned the tools and stacked the instruction booklets on a shelf. I took pictures for insurance records and then I put the phone away. This was not for social media. This was for the kids who lived within a 2-minute walk and had no place to gather. The first visitor was a neighbor who heard the squeak of a new swing while she rolled her trash bin back from the curb. She peeked through the slats, smiled in the quick way parents smile when they register a safe place, and asked with a nod if her kids could try it later. Word moved faster than any group chat. By late afternoon, there were 4 children in our yard, and shoe prints traced loops in the mulch. The sound was happy and ordinary. No one fought. No one argued about whose turn was next because there were enough options to move from swing to ladder to slide without breaking the flow. Parents stood by the side gate and talked about work and schedules and dinner plans. I kept one eye on the corners and watched for trouble. There was none. That evening, I swept the patio and closed the sandbox lid. I checked the mulch border and the gate latch. I noted which bolts might need a quick retighten after a week of use. I made a simple schedule in my head for quiet hours and cleanup, so there was no room for complaints about noise or mess. The rules could be respected while the spirit that had been missing could fill the space. The yard felt different because it had a function. It invited movement instead of expecting stillness. It was not a provocation. It was a solution. Monday morning arrived with the usual pattern. Commuters pulled out. School buses hissed at the corner. The street returned to its careful order. I walked to the curb to wheel back our bin and saw a white SUV pause by the house longer than normal. The passenger took a photo with a tablet, then another. The SUV moved on without a wave. I felt a small switch flip in my chest. The HOA noticed quickly when a bike leaned the wrong way. They would notice a play set even faster, even if it met every rule. I went inside and pulled the binder that held our covenants and my notes. I was ready for questions, and I was ready to be patient. I did not build a moment. I built a place. The difference mattered. By the end of the day, 2 emails arrived. One was neutral and procedural. It requested clarification on recent backyard additions and asked for measurements. The other was lighter and unexpected. A neighbor thanked us for creating a safe spot and offered to help with maintenance. The contrast framed the week ahead. On one side, paperwork and policy. On the other, community in the quiet form that shows up with a broom and an extra rake. I took a breath, opened a new document, and began typing a response that was factual, calm, and complete. The facts were simple. The play set was temporary by the HOA's definition, not visible from the street, within height limits, and installed with safety in mind. The yard closed at dusk and was monitored. Noise stayed within permitted hours. I attached the manual and a diagram. As the sun set, I listened from the back door to the new sounds of our home. Chains creaked softly. Mulch shifted. Laughter reached an easy pitch and then faded. The last parent waved from the gate and the latch clicked. The yard returned to stillness, but it was a living stillness, with the day's footprints recorded in small ridges of sand and tiny arcs in the mulch. I turned off the porch light and felt for the first time since the orange envelope that our house fit us again. The next morning would bring the first HOA visit. It was only a matter of time. The first official knock came at 9 in the morning, sharp enough to echo through the quiet hall. I had already anticipated it, sitting with a coffee gone lukewarm, the binder of HOA covenants laid open like armor. Through the glass of the front door, I saw the crisp white shirt, clipboard tucked under an arm, and a badge that wasn't law but carried the weight of neighborhood order. The HOA inspector wasn't smiling. His gaze scanned the driveway, the hedges, and then shifted toward the backyard fence as if he already knew what he would find. There was no attempt at small talk. His tone was clipped, professional, and rehearsed. He announced a routine inspection, prompted by a concern raised by a neighbor. The words didn't need names. The complaint had already been filed. The clipboard came up, a form was clicked into place, and the questions began like bullets from a script. Was there new construction? Did I have permits? Were structures anchored? Was the equipment visible from public areas? Each question mirrored the very guidelines I had studied late into the night. Each answer I gave was calm, documented, and supported by highlighted lines from the covenant itself. The inspector's pen hovered over boxes, reluctant but obligated to check them as compliant. The tour moved to the backyard. He measured the swing set, tapped the sandbox, crouched to look at bolts, and circled the mulch border as though he might find an angle that broke the rules. The set stood firm. The measurements matched the covenant down to the inch. The sandbox lid closed with a solid thump. The mulch looked neat, contained, and clearly intentional. For every detail, I had evidence waiting. He took photos, filling the silence with the snap of a digital shutter. I stood back, arms loose, and let the preparation speak louder than any argument I could make. By the time he left, the clipboard looked heavier than when he arrived. He did not say much, only that a formal report would be sent within 10 business days. The phrase carried weight, as though bureaucracy had more gravity than gravity itself. But I saw the hesitation in his posture, the way compliance was undeniable even when the complaint behind it wanted a violation. The playset stood like a quiet rebuttal against the rules meant to keep childhood invisible. The email came faster than expected. 2 days later, the HOA sent an official letter with language wrapped in politeness but lined with teeth. It acknowledged compliance in measurements, height, and placement. Then it introduced a new angle. Community harmony, it claimed, was disrupted by the sudden increase in traffic to the property. Children from other households gathering, laughter exceeding acceptable levels, and parents parking nearby for pickup were listed as concerns. No specific rule was cited. Instead, the letter leaned on vague phrases about maintaining the character of the neighborhood. It wasn't about bolts or boards anymore. It was about presence. That was the first move in what I later thought of as the paper war. Each letter became a weapon shaped like politeness. The HOA sent notices. I sent responses. They crafted paragraphs about aesthetic cohesion and anticipated nuisances. I answered with citations, highlighted PDFs and photographs of the street showing nothing blocked, nothing out of order, and nothing outside the allowed hours. They spoke of community impact. I countered with signed notes from neighbors who thanked us for giving their kids a safe place. The exchanges stacked like bricks, forming walls of words that defined a battle line. Each week, another envelope. Each week, another reply. Some were thin with a single page. Others were thick, stapled, and filled with supporting documentation. The rhythm became predictable. Friday brought an accusation. Monday brought my answer. Tuesday brought acknowledgement. Thursday brought escalation. By the end of the month, the binder that once held covenants now held dozens of letters, printed emails, and photographs arranged in order like chapters of an unfolding story. The most striking shift came when the HOA introduced temporary gatherings as a violation category. They claimed my yard had become a de facto playground that disrupted the intended residential use of the property. I read that line twice and then 3 more times. It was not children swinging that bothered them. It was the idea that children were visible, audible, and together in one place. The complaint was not about rules. It was about presence breaking the illusion of perfection. I built my responses with care. I included details about closing the yard at dusk, limiting use to daylight hours, supervising children at all times, and maintaining cleanliness each evening. I attached photos of swept mulch, raked sand, and locked gates. I emphasized that the equipment was residential grade, purchased and installed for private family use, not commercial or public. I ended with language from their own covenant. Temporary play structures not exceeding 8 feet in height are permissible if not anchored in permanent foundations and not visible from the street. Every word echoed their own rules back at them, leaving little room for reinterpretation. The more thorough my responses, the sharper their letters became. They shifted tone, appealing less to regulations and more to emotion. They wrote of concerns voiced by multiple members. They spoke of a community expectation of tranquility. They suggested that alternative recreational facilities exist within the city limits, as if public parks could replace the safety of a backyard. It became clear the rules were not the problem. The problem was resistance. Neighbors began to notice the strain. Parents whispered at the gate about letters they had seen before in their own mailboxes for smaller things. An overgrown bush, a basketball hoop, a wreath left past the season. They shared stories of fines that piled up quietly until checks were written in resignation. My binder full of letters was just a larger version of the same pattern. The difference was that I had chosen not to fold. Each envelope became another chance to stand firm. The HOA set a date for a formal hearing. Attendance required. Location: the clubhouse, that sterile building with beige walls and framed prints of generic landscapes. The notice arrived with bold letters at the top, potential violations to be addressed. The phrase carried weight, a warning, and a dare all at once. I knew what they wanted. They wanted submission, a quiet agreement to remove what bothered them. But I had already decided. The hearing would not be an ending. It would be the next stage. I prepared in silence. I organized the binder with tabs labeled measurements, photos, covenants, and testimonials. I printed copies of neighbor statements. I rehearsed the sequence of evidence in my head like a presentation. I did not plan to argue with emotion. I planned to dismantle their claims with their own documents. It would not be about anger. It would be about clarity. On the morning of the hearing, I walked past the playground and paused. The swings hung still, waiting. The sandbox lid closed tight. The mulch clean and even. The yard looked calm, intentional, and undeniable. It was not a nuisance. It was not chaos. It was the visible trace of family life lived openly. The clubhouse door would open soon. Inside, a table of board members would wait with their clipboards and their practiced tones. Outside, my yard waited with a quiet defiance built from cedar, bolts, and laughter that refused to stay silent. The clubhouse always looked empty from the outside, But that evening, its windows glowed with the sterile brightness of fluorescent lights. The parking lot, usually a hollow echo of tire tracks, was dotted with sedans lined up like soldiers. The notice had instructed me to arrive 15 minutes early, but I was already there with time to spare. My binder sat in the passenger seat, fat with letters, photographs, and highlighted pages that had become the record of our war. The engine ticked as it cooled, and I sat with the steady beat of nerves reminding me that this was not just a meeting. It was a performance of authority meant to remind me who was in charge. Inside, the air was heavy with the faint scent of disinfectant, and the paper rustle of documents shuffled into place. A long rectangular table stretched across the room. 5 members of the board sat evenly spaced, each with clipboards stacked in front of them, pens already poised. Their expressions carried the same carefully neutral look that hid annoyance under courtesy. They were not neighbors here. They were officials. Behind them, a corkboard displayed reminders of community events. But the edges curled like old wallpaper, ignored and faded. The chair of the board called the meeting to order with a gavel tap, unnecessary but theatrical. My case was listed third on the agenda after a fence dispute and a complaint about unauthorized shutters. When my name was spoken aloud, the tone held the weight of accusation disguised as formality. I carried my binder to the table and placed it down, its thud heavier than I expected. It was the sound of weeks of resistance, a weight that had grown each time I refused to fold. The board began with their framing of the issue. The words were calm, detached, and sharp. They acknowledged that my play structure met technical requirements, height, placement, and materials all within regulation. Then they pivoted. They spoke of unintended consequences. They described increased traffic to the property. They cited disturbances reported by residents and emphasized a responsibility to preserve neighborhood character. They did not name the families who supported us. They did not mention the notes of thanks. They spoke only of vague voices of complaint, amplified by their own authority. I opened my binder and began my presentation like a lecture built on evidence. Tab by tab, I laid out the facts. Measurements confirmed against covenant guidelines. Photos showing the set hidden from street view. Documents proving the equipment was temporary, not permanent construction. A section dedicated to noise, with decibel readings taken during play hours showing levels lower than passing lawnmowers. Another section with signed statements from neighbors who welcomed the playground as a safe space for their children. My tone never rose. I let the document speak, the highlighted text glaring like high beams against the board's carefully worded accusations. For every point they raised, I had a page ready. When they mentioned increased traffic, I showed photos of empty curbs and driveways untouched by visitors. When they spoke of disturbances, I presented statements describing laughter as the only sound, ending well before quiet hours. When they warned about character of the neighborhood, I held up the covenant itself. Its language focused on structures, not gatherings, its silence on laughter revealing the gap between their rules and their preferences. The board shifted in their chairs. Pens tapped. Eyes glanced at one another in silent exchanges. They had expected compliance or defensiveness. They had not expected a resident who arrived with their own language reflected back at them in organized order. For a moment, silence filled the space, broken only by the faint hum of the lights above. Then came the chair's closing words. They announced that a formal decision would be issued in writing within 2 weeks. They thanked me for my time, the phrase carrying more frost than warmth. The gavel tapped again, signaling the end of my portion, though the tension in the room lingered like humidity. I gathered my binder, nodded once, and left without looking back. Outside, the night air felt cleaner, sharper. The stars hung faint against the suburban glow, and the sound of crickets filled the stillness. I placed the binder back in the car and sat for a moment before driving home. The hearing had not ended anything. It had only pushed the battle forward into new territory. I had shown them the facts. Now it was their turn to decide whether rules meant what they wrote or whether power meant bending them to fit preference. Back at home, the playground waited under moonlight. The swing shifted gently in the night breeze. The mulch held footprints that would be gone by morning. It stood as both evidence and reminder. I had not built rebellion. I had built something that belonged. The decision would come soon. Whatever it said, it would shape not just my family's yard, but the way neighbors understood the boundaries of control. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, slipped into the mailbox without ceremony. It was thinner than I expected, only 2 pages long, but the weight of its contents pulled at me as though it were bound in iron. The board had reviewed the matter thoroughly and determined that while the play structure was technically within regulations, the use of the space posed an ongoing concern. The letter urged voluntary removal to preserve community harmony and warned that failure to comply could lead to further actions, including legal remedies. It was a decision that admitted compliance but punished presence. By evening, the neighborhood had already begun to split. News travels faster than envelopes in a community where curiosity clings to porch railings. Some families knocked on our door that same night, offering words of encouragement, cookies wrapped in foil, or quick smiles that carried the weight of alliance. Others crossed the street instead of walking past our house, their glances sharp and short. The playground had become more than swings and mulch. It had become a symbol, and symbols rarely leave people neutral. On one side, parents with children gravitated to the yard. They saw safety, laughter, and a relief from the invisible pressure of keeping kids silent in a neighborhood that wanted to look lived in without ever admitting to life. They offered to bring extra mulch, to help repaint when the wood weathered, to take turns watching the gate. On the other side, homeowners without children or those invested deeply in appearances whispered about property values and precedent. They worried that visible joy might translate into falling house prices, though no data supported the fear. It was not about numbers. It was about control. The first sign of division appeared on the street itself. Cars belonging to supportive parents parked openly near our curb during afternoons. They laughed louder, waved longer, lingered with purpose. Across the way, blinds shifted, curtains twitched, and complaints began to multiply. Anonymous notes started to appear in mailboxes, not just mine, but neighbors. Some praised the playground, others scolded the noise. The street felt less like a cul-de-sac and more like a chessboard, each house holding a piece waiting to move. The HOA sensed the shift and escalated. They distributed flyers claiming the playground posed liability risks to the community. The wording suggested danger where none existed, painting images of lawsuits and injuries. I countered by sending copies of our homeowner's insurance rider to supportive neighbors, showing clear coverage and safety measures. The board used fear. I used transparency. The paper war had spilled into the homes of everyone around us. Tension built in subtler ways, too. Lawn greetings became shorter. Invitations to block parties went unanswered. Conversations shifted tone when certain names came up. The division wasn't violent, but it was persistent, like a crack in concrete that deepens each time water finds its way inside. Children, of course, ignored it all. They kept swinging, sliding, and building castles in the sandbox as though adults' arguments lived in a different world entirely. Their laughter rang across the divide, refusing to choose a side. The stress reached a peak one Saturday when the HOA president herself arrived at the edge of the yard. She didn't step inside. She didn't need to. Her presence was both a warning and a test. Parents froze mid-conversation, children slowed their games, and for a long moment the air hung heavy with expectation. But then the swing chains creaked again and the rhythm of play returned. Her lips pressed tight, her pen scratched notes onto a pad, and she walked away without a word. The silence she left behind felt heavier than any gavel strike. After that, the playground became more crowded. Families who had stayed cautious now visited openly, as if defiance was contagious. We hosted impromptu picnics, cleaned together, and watched the children build friendships stronger than the invisible walls rising between adults. The HOA sent more letters, but the neighborhood had begun to answer in its own way. Unity formed in patches, a quilt of small rebellions stitched together by laughter and shared responsibility. Yet division deepened elsewhere. One neighbor filed a noise complaint with the city, bypassing the HOA entirely. Another threatened to call code enforcement, though the codes were clear and I remained in compliance. Sidewalk conversations grew sharp, filled with muttered judgments. The cul-de-sac no longer felt uniform. It felt alive, fractured, and unwilling to return to silence. Through it all, the binder grew thicker. Each letter, each complaint, each supportive note slid into its sleeves until it no longer closed flat. It had become more than a record. It was the story of a street caught between two versions of itself, one polished and quiet, the other messy and full of life. By late summer, the HOA announced an emergency community meeting. The flyer used careful language, addressing concerns, ensuring cohesion, finding solutions, but everyone knew what it meant. The board wanted a showdown, a final attempt to rally support against the playground before their authority fractured completely. The clubhouse lights would glow again. This time it would not just be board members behind a table. It would be the entire neighborhood, divided, each side ready to raise their voices. The clubhouse had never been so full. Folding chairs lined the walls, their metal legs scraping the floor as neighbors squeezed into every available space. The air was thick with the low murmur of voices, punctuated by the occasional laugh on one side and sharp whispers on the other. The playground had done what no summer barbecue or holiday potluck ever managed. It had drawn the entire community together, but not in unity, in division. At the front, the HOA board sat in a tight row, papers stacked neatly, pens aligned as if precision alone could command order. The president, her expression carved in stone, tapped the gavel once and called the meeting to order. Her voice carried the authority of someone used to obedience, but tonight it met resistance. The energy in the room wasn't passive. It was restless, waiting, brimming. The agenda was brief. Item 1, addressing the playground issue. No disguises this time. No vague phrases about harmony or tranquility. It was direct, and so was the mood of the residents. The president began by outlining the board's position. While the structure technically complied with regulations, its impact on neighborhood cohesion was disruptive. She spoke of traffic, noise, liability, and the erosion of the community's character. Her words were polished, but the edge of irritation sharpened every sentence. When she finished, murmurs rippled through the room. Then came the voices of the residents. Parents stood and spoke first, their words carrying the weight of lived experience. They described afternoons where their children played safely without wandering into streets. They described friendships built across backyards, laughter echoing in ways no rule could erase. One father described how the playground had become a refuge for his shy daughter, who had never found a place in the carefully manicured silence of the neighborhood. Applause followed his words, loud enough to shake the fluorescent lights above. Not everyone clapped. A retired couple rose next, their tone sharp with disapproval. They spoke of sleepless afternoons, of property values they believed were threatened, of fears that the neighborhood was losing its standards. Their words were met with nods from a cluster of residents seated tightly together, arms crossed, lips pursed. The divide was no longer hidden. It was painted across the room in every shift of posture and every glance. Back and forth the testimonies went, a tug of war between silence and sound, between order and life. Each voice added to the weight of the room. Each story shaped the narrative of what the playground meant, nuisance or necessity, rebellion or revival. When my turn came, I stood slowly, the binder in my hands heavier than ever before. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I looked at the faces, friends, critics, strangers who lived within steps of my front door. I spoke calmly, not with anger, but with certainty. I reminded them that the playground followed every written rule, that the board itself had admitted as much. I reminded them that rules exist to provide clarity, not to erase the spirit of community. Then I opened the binder and showed them the evidence, photographs, highlighted covenants, signed notes of support. Page after page of compliance, page after page of proof. But facts alone would not end this. So I closed the binder and spoke from a different place. I spoke of my son's first wobbly ride on his bike, of the orange envelope that reduced it to a violation. I spoke of how neighborhoods are supposed to grow with the families inside them, not cage them into silence. I spoke of laughter as the sound of life, not a threat to property. And when I finished, I didn't ask for permission. I simply stated that the playground was here to stay, because it belonged as much as any trimmed hedge or polished driveway. The room erupted. Applause thundered from one side, while angry voices rose from the other. The gavel struck again and again, desperate to restore order, but the divide was too deep now. The board huddled briefly, their whispers urgent, their faces taut. Finally, the president spoke. The board, she announced, would not pursue legal action at this time. The decision was framed as temporary, couched in language about continued review, but the truth was visible in their eyes. They had lost control. The meeting ended in noise, conversations spilling into the parking lot, alliances cemented in the glow of streetlights. Neighbors clustered in groups, some energized, some bitter, all changed. The cul-de-sac would never return to the quiet uniformity it once claimed. The playground had broken that illusion. In the weeks that followed, the HOA sent fewer letters. Their silence was not approval, but retreat. The binder on my shelf grew dusty. Its war of paper paused. The playground, however, did not pause. It filled with children each afternoon, their voices rising into the sky, unafraid, undeniable. Parents traded shifts at the gate, shared snacks, and built a rhythm of community that no covenant could contain. The neighborhood had divided, but it had also revealed itself. Behind the manicured lawns and matching mailboxes lived people with lives too messy, too vibrant, too human to be hidden forever. The playground had simply made that truth visible. As I watched my children swing higher than the fence line, their laughter carrying over rooftops, I realized that victory was not in defeating the HOA. Victory was in refusing to let silence define us. The story had begun with a bike left in a driveway. It ended with a playground that became the heartbeat of a community, louder and stronger than any gavel could ever silence.